The year 480 BCE marks a pivotal and dramatic juncture in ancient history. The Battle of Thermopylae, a land-based clash, is widely celebrated as the quintessential struggle between the Greeks and the Persian Empire. However, it did not occur in isolation. Concurrently, a short distance across the straits near Euboea's northern tip, another critical encounter unfolded: the naval Battle of Artemisium. Often overshadowed by the valor displayed at Thermopylae, Artemisium was, in fact, an indispensable complement. Without Artemisium, the Greek resistance at Thermopylae would have crumbled even sooner. Conversely, absent Thermopylae, Artemisium would have lacked strategic significance. Together, they represented a coordinated defensive strategy aimed at impeding the Persian advance by both land and sea. Before we delve into the main content, please consider subscribing to my channel, giving a like, leaving a comment, and share to support me in bringing more great videos to you. Thank you so much. As Xerxes' massive invasion force pressed into Greece, the cities of the Hellenic League knew they were facing a military machine of unparalleled strength. The Persian fleet, comprising hundreds of triremes from Phoenicia, Egypt, Cilicia, Cyprus, Ionia, and other subjugated nations, significantly outnumbered the Greek navy. Greek estimates placed the Persian fleet at over 1,200 ships at the campaign's outset, nearly 3 times the size of the Greek fleet assembled at Artemisium. The Greeks, spearheaded primarily by Athens, contributed approximately 270 triremes to the defense. The Spartans, while dominant on land, had only a modest naval presence. Athens, thanks to Themistocles' prescient planning years earlier, had constructed a formidable navy funded by the newly discovered silver mines at Laurion. This naval strength enabled a coordinated land-sea defense. Artemisium was strategically chosen for its narrow waters between mainland Greece and the island of Euboea. This constrained the Persian fleet, preventing their superior numbers from being effectively deployed. Much like Leonidas' selection of the narrow pass at Thermopylae for the land engagement, the Greek fleet designated Artemisium as their naval choke point. This mirrored strategy wasn't coincidental. It was a meticulously crafted defensive plan intended to delay the Persians long enough to safeguard the Greek heartlands. Before the first clash, the Persians suffered a major setback. A fierce storm struck off the coast of Magnesia, severely damaging the Persian fleet. Many ships were wrecked on the rocks or capsized in violent currents, resulting in the loss of hundreds of vessels. The Greeks interpreted this natural disaster as a divine sign of support for their resistance. Nevertheless, despite these losses, the Persian fleet remained immense, far exceeding anything the Greeks could muster. When the Persians regrouped near Phedae, they prepared to advance through the Straits of Artemisium and overwhelm the Greek naval presence. Themistocles, commanding the Greek forces, understood that Artemisium was a delaying action designed to buy crucial time for the defenders at Thermopylae. If the Persian fleet broke through quickly, they could circumnavigate Euboea and land troops behind Leonidas, potentially trapping and annihilating the Greek land force. The Greek commanders assumed their positions, acutely aware of these grave consequences. Unity within the Greek fleet was fragile, with contingents from various city-states each having distinct priorities. Some favored an immediate retreat south, fearing the overwhelming Persian numbers. However, Themistocles urged them to stand firm, arguing that abandoning Artemisium would leave all of Greece north of Attica undefended, shattering the morale of the entire Greek resistance. The Greek naval formation reflected their tactical philosophy: tight, disciplined maneuvers relying on the strength and coordination of their highly trained crews. Greek triremes, though fewer, were sturdy, fast, and manned by professional rowers with years of training. In contrast, the Persian fleet, while including many skilled sailors, particularly the Phoenicians and Egyptians, also comprised conscripted or less experienced rowers from conquered provinces. Initial contact between the fleets wasn't immediate. The Greeks waited, carefully observing Persian scout ships entering the waters near Artemisium. Tensions escalated with reports of a large Persian detachment attempting to sail around Euboea, encircling the Greek fleet. If successful, the Greeks risked being trapped at sea, mirroring potential encirclement of Leonidas on land. Realizing the danger, Themistocles made a bold decision. Instead of remaining defensively, The Greeks would strike first, launching a surprise attack at dusk against a Persian detachment. The ensuing battle, though brief, showcased the superior cohesion of the Greek fleet, which disabled or captured several enemy ships. This success boosted Greek morale and strengthened their resolve. As night descended, the two powerful fleets hovered in close proximity, campfires burning along the shores. From Artemisium, the Greeks could see distant firelight reflecting on the water from the Persian fleet, which was still recovering from the storm and preparing for the next day's battle. In between, the dark waters of the strait whispered with a cold wind, concealing the peril awaiting both sides. The Greeks knew that dawn would bring their first full-scale naval confrontation with the Persian Empire. They were outnumbered, exhausted, and carrying the fate of Greece on their shoulders. Yet none wavered. Artemisium transformed into more than just a battlefield. It became a sanctuary of shared purpose, linking the fate of the fleet to the warriors at Thermopylae. Thermopylae guarded the land path, Artemisium guarded the sea path, and together they formed a unified line of defense. The battle to come would test not only strength, but also discipline, strategy, and the ability to endure overwhelming odds. As the second day of the naval campaign at Artemisium dawned, both sides were keenly aware of the scale of the confrontation. The Greeks, despite being heavily outnumbered, commenced the morning with enhanced cohesion and confidence. Conversely, the Persian commanders, frustrated by their inability to breach the Greek defensive line the previous day, aimed to press harder. The Achaemenid High Command believed their numerical superiority would eventually overwhelm the smaller Greek fleet, yet the narrow straits continued to hinder them, compressing their formations and impeding their favorite tactic of encircling and crushing the enemy. Themistocles was fully aware that the second day would be pivotal. He spent the early hours moving from ship to ship, directly addressing the Athenian rowers and marines. His tone was steady, almost conversational, as he reminded them that Greece's fate hinged not only on Thermopylae, but also on Artemisium. The fall of their fleet would allow the Persians to bypass the mountain pass entirely and strike southern Greece from the sea. The Spartans were holding the land front, but without naval support, their position would become untenable. Themistocles' message united the fleet with a sense of shared destiny. Artemisium was not simply a battle, but a shield protecting all of Greece. When the Persian fleet reappeared, their ships formed a wider arc than the previous day, attempting to envelop the Greek right wing. The sea was calmer than the first day, but the narrowness of the channel continued to favor the Greeks. As the Persians extended their line, the Greek commanders recognized an opportunity. Rather than waiting for the encirclement to close, the Greeks launched a sudden forward surge, slamming directly into the center of the Persian formation. This unexpected maneuver caused immediate confusion among the Persian rowers, who had anticipated the Greeks remaining on the defensive. The ensuing battle was chaotic and thunderous. Greek hoplites stationed on the decks fought with spears and shields, leveraging their superior armor to dominate close-quarters combat. The Persians, armed with shorter spears and lighter armor, sought to overwhelm with numbers, but the confined space limited their maneuverability. In several recorded instances, Greek triremes rammed Persian galleys with devastating precision, splintering hulls and forcing entire crews into the sea. The Athenians, with their highly trained rowers, executed the attack and withdraw rhythm flawlessly. A decisive moment occurred when a contingent of Ionian ships, Greeks forced into Persian service, held back slightly, creating an unintended gap in the Persian line. Whether this was deliberate, driven by ethnic sympathy, or simply due to confusion remains debated, but its impact was undeniable. Themistocles immediately recognized the hesitation and ordered the Greek center to exploit the gap. This sudden strike shocked the Persian commanders, who struggled to reinforce the faltering section of their formation. Despite this tactical edge, the Greeks continued to suffer losses. Several Athenian ships were either damaged or boarded, and numerous marines were lost at sea. However, the Greeks displayed extraordinary discipline by maintaining formation even under heavy pressure. They refused to scatter, which would have allowed the Persians to break them apart. The close-knit Greek line became a shield wall on the water. During the height of the fighting, a storm began forming to the northeast, one of the recurring natural phenomena of this campaign. Greek lookouts spotted the shifting clouds early, but the Persians were fully engaged in the clash and paid little attention. By late afternoon, the winds intensified and the waves began to swell. Realizing the danger, the Greeks disengaged with deliberate discipline, retreating into more sheltered part of the strait where they could anchor safely. The Persians, caught farther out, were battered by the storm as they attempted to regroup. The storm, arriving at such a critical moment, acted almost as a second Greek victory. Although the Persians had not been defeated in open combat, their damaged ships were scattered, and many units struggled to maintain coherence. The Greeks, meanwhile, spent a stormy night repairing hulls, replacing oars, and tending to the wounded. Themistocles called a council, urging the commanders to remain firm. Victory at Artemisium was not measured in enemy corpses, but in time gained. Every day they held back the Persian navy was another day Leonidas and his forces could hold Thermopylae. News arrived that the Persians had lost several dozen ships to the storm, further narrowing the numerical gap. However, Themistocles remained cautious, stressing that even a weakened Persian fleet was still far larger than theirs. The Greeks needed to avoid overconfidence and continue using the terrain wisely. As the commanders dispersed for the night, the atmosphere in the Greek camp was a mixture of exhaustion, anxiety, and quiet pride. They had survived 2 days against what was arguably the largest naval force the world had ever seen. The men understood that the next day could bring the decisive clash, another storm, or breaking news from Thermopylae. The fate of Greece now hung on 2 fronts simultaneously, and Artemisium's defenders were determined to hold their line as long as humanly possible. The 3rd day at Artemisium began under a strained silence. The previous night's storm had subsided, leaving behind a churning, uneasy sea and wreckage scattered across the waters. Broken Persian hulls drifted aimlessly, a grim reminder of the night's devastation. The Greeks, having spent the dark hours repairing their own ships, emerged exhausted but determined. They knew that the next confrontation would almost certainly decide whether they could continue holding the straits or be forced to retreat. Themistocles gathered the commanders early in the morning. His assessment was blunt but clear. The Persians were still numerically superior, but their morale and formation had been shaken. He emphasized that the Greeks must strike boldly that day before the Persian navy could reorganize or receive reinforcements from the land forces advancing south. The commanders agreed almost unanimously. The plan was simple yet dangerous. Meet the Persian fleet head-on, disrupt them before they recovered, and inflict enough damage to force a withdrawal. When the Persian ships appeared on the horizon, it became immediately clear that the Achaemenid High Command intended to regain control through overwhelming force. Their fleet advanced in multiple staggered lines, a dense wall of hulls stretching across the sea. Though smaller in number than at the beginning of the campaign, it was still one of the most formidable naval forces ever assembled. Drums thundered across the water. Flags snapped in the wind. This was the Persian Empire's attempt to crush Greek resistance once and for all. The Greeks responded by tightening their formation into a compact wedge. This structure allowed them to pierce the Persian line, while preventing themselves from being spread apart. At Themistocles' signal, the Greek rowers drove forward with unified, powerful strokes. The triremes surged through the waves, gaining momentum as the distance closed. Each commander knew the stakes. If they broke that day, Artemisium and Thermopylae would fall together. The initial collision was brutal. Greek rams smashed into Persian hulls, driving deep into wooden frames and sending splinters flying. The sound of bronze hitting timber reverberated across the waves. Persian troops attempted to board the Greek ships, but the hoplites, armored, disciplined, and fighting shoulder to shoulder, dominated every close-quarter clash. The Greeks had learned from the previous battles and now executed coordinated maneuvers, attacking in bursts and retreating in synchronized sweeps that left the Persians struggling to respond. One of the most intense moments came when a large Phoenician detachment attempted to encircle the Greek left wing. These Phoenician crews, considered among the best sailors in the Persian fleet, moved swiftly and almost succeeded in turning the flank. But Themistocles anticipated the maneuver. He redirected a reserve group of Athenian triremes, who rowed at full speed to reinforce the threatened wing. The two naval groups collided violently, scattering the Phoenician attempt and restoring balance to the Greek line. Farther along the battlefront, Corinthian ships executed a daring tactic. A sudden thrust into a Persian gap created during the chaos. They rammed 2 enemy vessels in quick succession, then withdrew before the Persians could retaliate. This hit-and-run style, fast, precise, and disciplined, became one of the defining features of the Greek resistance at Artemisium. By midday, the sea had descended into a chaotic melee of drifting wrecks, clashing soldiers, and the cries of rowers struggling to regain rhythm. Yet despite incredible pressure, the Greek fleet continued to hold. They had mastered the terrain, used the current to their advantage, and maintained a cohesion that the vast and diverse Persian fleet could not match. Themistocles' orders were calm but urgent, carried across the water through signal flags. Maintain formation. Strike only when openings appear. Preserve the line. The Greeks obeyed with unwavering discipline. But the Persians, driven by imperial command and sheer numbers, refused to retreat. They regrouped repeatedly, pushing waves of reinforcements toward the Greek center. The third day became a test of endurance, more than tactics or bold maneuvers. Greek ships began to show signs of strain, or shafts cracked, armor dented. Hoplites fought despite wounds, refusing to yield a single meter of water. The Persians sensed a weakening of the Greek center and intensified their pressure. In one recorded instance, a cluster of Persian ships managed to break through temporarily, isolating a small unit of Athenian triremes. The surrounded Greek ships fought ferociously, forming a defensive circle and repelling boarding attempts. Their stubborn resistance bought enough time for reinforcements to arrive, pushing the Persians back yet again. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, exhaustion gripped both sides. Greek commanders finally ordered a slow, controlled withdrawal toward the inner curve of the straits. This was not a retreat and defeat, but a tactical decision. The fleet needed space to regroup and prepare for the inevitable next phase. The Persians, equally spent, did not pursue aggressively. Their lines had frayed, and they had no desire to fight in the most constricted part of the channel. But before the Greeks could fully settle into their defensive position, messengers arrived by small boat, carrying devastating news. Thermopylae had fallen. Leonidas and the Spartans were dead. The Persian army now had a clear path into central Greece. The news struck the Greek commanders like a physical blow. Artemisium was no longer a delaying action. It had become a completed mission. Their goal, by time for the land forces, had succeeded, but the cost was the inevitable end of the naval stand. Themistocles quickly made his decision. The Greek fleet would withdraw under cover of night. Continuing the fight at Artemisium served no further strategic purpose. The Persians could now land troops behind them or cut off their retreat. The commanders agreed with heavy hearts, aware that they had fought valiantly but must now preserve what remained of the fleet for the larger war ahead, especially the defense of Salamis. Night fell quietly. Greek ships drifted silently from the straits, their sails lowered, their oars cutting gently through dark water. Behind them, the Strait of Artemisium, the battleground that had consumed 3 brutal days, fell silent. But its legacy was far from over. The coming battles would decide the fate of Greece, and the survivors of Artemisium would play a pivotal role. As dawn broke over the straits on the 3rd day of the conflict, the Battle of Artemisium reached a moment where every decision held enormous strategic weight. The Greek commanders, Eurybiades of Sparta and Themistocles of Athens, began the morning by evaluating condition of their fleet. Many ships showed signs of damage. Splintered rams, cracked wooden frames, exhausted oarsmen who had barely rested through the night. Yet their morale, strangely enough, did not collapse. The knowledge that they were holding back the largest naval power of the known world ignited a fierce determination among the crews. The Persian fleet, although battered by storms and by the Greeks' defensive tactics, remained numerically overwhelming. Reports indicated that reinforcements from the southern wing of Xerxes' navy were expected later in the day. If the Greeks delayed too long, they risked being encircled entirely. But retreating early might expose the flank of the army, still holding the line at Thermopylae. Themistocles argued forcefully. Their purpose at Artemisium was not to win a decisive naval victory. It was to buy time, disrupt the Persian momentum, and keep the pressure off the Spartan-led infantry on land. By midday, the Persians advanced with renewed aggression. Their commanders attempted to adapt to Greek defensive tactics by spreading the fleet wider, hoping to envelop and crush the smaller Greek formation. Themistocles recognized the maneuver immediately. He ordered the Greek ships to tighten into a porpax formation, a compact, shield-like structure that allowed them to pivot rapidly without exposing their flanks. In this tight arrangement, the triremes maintained mutual cover, forcing the Persians into narrower attack angles. The battle intensified when the Persians launched dozens of small, agile vessels to disrupt the Greek line. These ships darted forward, aiming to break cohesion, but the Greek archers, stationed on elevated decks, unleashed precise volleys that disrupted the assault. Moments later, the heavier Persian triremes surged in behind them, creating chaos throughout the central lanes of the battlefield. The sound of a cracking echoed across the water as rams collided. Crews shouted commands, and the sea churned violently beneath hundreds of oars. One of the most critical moments occurred near late afternoon. A squadron of Phoenician ships attempted a direct breakthrough on the Greek right wing. Their coordination was nearly perfect. Wave after wave pressed into the same point, hoping to collapse the Greek line from the edge. If they succeeded, the Persians would gain the angle needed to roll up the entire fleet from the side. Recognizing this threat, Themistocles personally directed a cluster of Athenian triremes to reinforce the right wing. These Athenian ships, built for speed and maneuverability, executed a sharp counterflanking movement, circling behind the Phoenician squadron and ramming them from their exposed rear. The sudden reversal stunned the Persians, disrupting the entire breakthrough attempt. However, the Greeks paid a heavy price for this bold maneuver. Several Athenian ships took severe damage, and dozens of rowers were lost. Themistocles knew they could not sustain many more such engagements. Time was running out. As the sun descended toward the horizon, thick smoke on the water made it difficult to distinguish friend from foe. But despite the chaos, one fact became increasingly clear. The Persians were struggling to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Their numerical advantage was undeniable, but Artemisium's narrow waters limited their ability to maneuver. For every ship they attempted to push into the front line, another faced obstruction from its own allies. The Greek defensive ability, mastering the terrain of the sea, continued to offset their disadvantage. Yet just as the Greeks sensed a temporary stabilization, a messenger ship arrived with disastrous news from the south. Thermopylae had fallen. Leonidas and his Spartan-led defenders had been overwhelmed after a traitor revealed a hidden path in the mountains. The Greek land defense was shattered. For the commanders at Artemisium, this changed everything instantly. Their purpose had been to protect the flank of the Thermopylae defense. With Leonidas defeated, remaining at Artemisium no longer had strategic value. Worse, the Persian army would soon march unopposed toward central Greece, threatening cities and supply lines. The fleet risked entrapment if it lingered even another day. In the moments that followed, Themistocles demonstrated the calm decisiveness that later defined his legacy. He ordered the Greeks to disengage in a controlled retreat toward the island of Salamis. Speed was essential, but discipline even more so, for a hurried withdrawal could easily devolve into chaos. The oarsmen, exhausted as they were, responded with remarkable unity. The Persians attempted to pursue, but the onset of night and the exhaustion of their own crews slowed the chase. Moreover, they suffered from their own overconfidence. Believing that with Thermopylae won, naval victory would soon follow automatically, they did not press the retreating Greeks with maximum force. This miscalculation would become one of the greatest strategic errors of Xerxes' campaign, and set the stage for the much more consequential Battle of Salamis. As the Greek fleet pulled away into the darkness, Artemisium's waters grew eerily quiet. The sea carried drifting debris, broken oars, shattered wood, the remnants of a 3 days struggle whose outcome was not measured in territory gained but in strategic time earned. The Greeks had not defeated the Persian navy, but they had achieved something equally valuable. They preserved their fleet, delayed Xerxes' advance, probed Persian weaknesses, and gained critical experience that would soon reshape the war. The Battle of Artemisium, though often overshadowed by the drama of Thermopylae and the triumph at Salamis, was a turning point in the naval dimension of the Greco-Persian Wars. It proved that the Persians were not invincible at sea, that disciplined formations could neutralize overwhelming numbers, and that Greek naval unity was not only possible but decisive. Artemisium was a test. Salamis would become the answer. As the Greek fleet steered southward into the widening waters of the Aegean, the Battle of Artemisium reached its strategic conclusion, less dramatic than the flames of victory or defeat, yet carrying immense long-term consequences. The battle had ended not with a single decisive strike, but through accumulated pressure, tactical learning, and calculated resilience. Artemisium was, in many ways, a crucible, a 3-day ordeal that hardened the Greek navy for the titanic confrontation soon to come. In the immediate aftermath, the Greek commanders called for an emergency council aboard one of the larger triremes. The sailors, still recovering from exhaustion and injuries, watched as Themistocles, Eurybiades, and the regional admirals debated the next course of action. The news of Thermopylae's fall weighed heavily on every mind. Leonidas was dead, the hot gates were lost, and Xerxes' army was now marching unopposed into the heart of Greece. But Themistocles saw in this disaster a clear path forward. He reminded the council that the fleet was now the last line of defense. Without the sea, the mainland could not be protected. Without mobility, no Greek city-state would stand a chance against Persia's vast logistical network. Themistocles insisted that the fleet must regroup at Salamis, where geography would. Here's the translated and slightly expanded version, aiming for clarity and a smooth reading experience. To once again negate Persia's overwhelming numerical advantage, much like the narrow straits of Artemisium had done for 3 days. Before the Greek fleet arrived at Salamis, Themistocles strategically paused at several coastal towns, directing his men to inscribe messages onto prominent stone markers. These messages weren't for the Greeks themselves, but for the Ionian Greeks who were being forced to serve in the Persian navy against their will. The inscriptions implored them to sabotage Persian operations, to hold back during battle, or, if possible, to defect to the Greek side. The psychological gamble was undeniably bold and fraught with risk, yet successfully sowed seeds of doubt within Xerxes' ranks. Meanwhile, the Persian commanders misinterpreted the Greek withdrawal as a sign of utter collapse. Despite acknowledging the damage their own fleet had sustained, they remained steadfastly confident in their inevitable victory. Their assumption was that the Greeks would continue their retreat indefinitely, abandoning one region after another until Persia had completely absorbed the Aegean. This misjudgment was precisely what Themistocles had been banking on. The Persians believed they were pursuing a defeated foe, completely oblivious of the fact that they were being carefully led toward a battleground specifically chosen for its tactical advantage. Back at Artemisium, the sea gradually calmed. The floating debris field began to dissipate, and bodies washed ashore, mingled with the wreckage of shattered planks and splintered oars. The vast majority of Persian sailors who perished during the storms and the brutal clash were never recovered. The region, largely forgotten in the aftermath of the battle, stood as a silent testament to the immense cost of naval warfare, a cost that nations frequently underestimated until they were confronted by it directly. As the Greeks drew closer to Salamis, morale fluctuated wildly between sheer exhaustion and unwavering determination. The Athenian sailors, in particular, carried a tremendous weight on their shoulders. They were acutely aware that their beloved city would soon be evacuated. The women, children, and elderly of Athens would be transported to the relative safety of Treason and the nearby islands, while the relentless Persian army swept down into Attica. Yet this looming tragedy only served to strengthen their resolve. If the fleet emerged victorious, Athens could be reclaimed. If the fleet fell, everything would be lost forever, irretrievably. Upon reaching Salamis, the battered fleet was quickly reorganized, repaired to the best of their ability, and resupplied with essentials. Themistocles skillfully applied the hard-won lessons of Artemisium to shape their strategy for the coming battle. Maintain extremely tight and disciplined formations. Artemisium had clearly demonstrated that Greek naval strength lay not in individual ships, but in highly coordinated maneuvering. Exploit the narrow waters of straits. The open seas favored the Persians and their superior numbers. Confined straits effectively negated that advantage. Preserve endurance and fight efficiently. After 3 grueling days of continuous fighting, Themistocles understood that fatigue could erode discipline more quickly than enemy attacks. Trust the experience they had gained. Many sailors who had entered the battle at Artemisium as inexperienced recruits had emerged as hardened veterans. They had witnessed Persian tactics firsthand, identified their strengths, their limitations, and most importantly, their vulnerability in close-quarters combat. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Artemisium was psychological. The Greeks now firmly believed that the Persian advance could be stopped at sea. The pervasive belief in Persian naval invincibility, which had been so deeply ingrained before the battle, was irrevocably shattered. Even the Spartan commanders, who had initially questioned the value of naval warfare, now grudgingly admitted that without Artemisium's crucial delaying action, the war would likely already be over. Artemisium also revealed something profound about the fragile Greek coalition. It unequivocally demonstrated that Greek unity, though often precarious, was indeed achievable when faced with an existential threat. The Athenians and Spartans, despite their often divergent priorities, fought side by side with unwavering determination. City-states that frequently quarreled in peacetime discovered that cooperation was not only possible, but absolutely essential for survival. This newfound unity, forged in the crucible of Artemisium, will become the bedrock of Greek resistance throughout the remainder of the war. Through the lens of history, the Battle of Artemisium is often overshadowed by the legendary heroism of Thermopylae and the monumental victory at Salamis. Yet, without Artemisium, without the crucial battle testing of Greek formations, without the clear demonstration of Persian limitations, without the precious time bought for evacuation and strategic regrouping, Salamis simply would not have been possible. Artemisium was not a victory in the traditional sense of conquered territory. It was a strategic success whose true value was measured not in captured land, but in preserved capability. It allowed Greece to retreat without breaking, to learn from its mistakes without being utterly destroyed, and prepare for final confrontation without surrendering the initiative. As night fell around Salamis and the Greek fleet anchored in silent rows, the men looked back at Artemisium not with overwhelming pride or bitter regret, but with profound understanding that they had survived the storm engineered by a seemingly unstoppable empire. They had faced the greatest navy in the world, and they had lived to tell the tale. And now, armed with newfound experience, hardened by trial, and inspired by both the sting of loss and the glimmer of hope, they stood ready for the decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of Greece. Artemisium was a critical rehearsal. Salamis would be their ultimate destiny.